Oh, folks, I just get a little smile on my face every time I hear that tune because it means it's time for another episode of the Rec Poker Podcast. Boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, how lucky are we? I know I'm the luckiest guy in the world because I get to hang out here every week and talk to my poker friends about this amazing game that we all love so much. My name's Jim Reed. I'll be your host tonight. I go by Bluff Sterini in the home game and at Rec Poker Jim on Twitter. And if you want to find out more about me, you can go to rec.poker/crew and you can learn about everyone on the Wrecking Crew. The Wrecking Crew is kind of our core team of members who put together our premium training material, who come on the podcast, who do a lot of the legwork for the study groups and our strategy videos and that kind of stuff. And we love just sharing our love of poker with the world. So yeah, go to rec.poker/crew and you can learn more about them, or you can just listen up because you're going to meet a few of them right now.
I'm Chris Jones. You can find me 5B5 on Twitter or 5x5 in the PokerStars home game.
And I'm John Somsky. I am Poker Geek Gammon everywhere.
And I'm Rob Washam, and I'm Rabman 50 just about everywhere.
And the Wrecking Crew, like I say, they're our core team. They've got a passion for poker like you wouldn't believe. A lot of what we do here is free. It's a mostly volunteer organization. It's free to join. If you have an email address and a smile, you just need to go to www.rec.poker and sign up for a free account. But you can go premium, and we love it when our premium members come and join us in the chat as we're talking about different concepts in poker strategy. And the premium membership makes a big difference. We honestly couldn't do what we do here without our premium members chipping in their $15 a month. So it's my pleasure to welcome John Crowell back to the show. John, thanks for coming back on. And where can people recognize your name if they see you in the Rec Poker home games?
7 high 11 in the home game, and I'm a Luddite, so I'm nothing else anywhere else.
There you go. Yeah, and if you see 7 high 11 posting in the forums, that's another place to catch some of this great gentleman's brain. We love cracking it open and talking poker with John and other premium members here on the Rec Poker Podcast. This is the forums edition. So instead of talking to a guest, we're going to be breaking into one of the hands or one of the posts from our forums. Again, free to join. I encourage everyone to come and check it out. This is from John himself, the one and only 7 high 11. And the name of this forum post is Opening Ranges Against Multiple Limpers. So there's a great post in here. We've got some good responses. It's a long one. There's a lot of juicy information to get into. But John, since you're here, why don't you just tell us a little bit about sort of what caused you to put this post out there? You're playing and you're playing in a game where you tend to face a lot of limps. And so you're kind of struggling with what hands to choose to raise over limpers with, what hands to call with, what sizings to use. Kind of paint a picture for the questions you were trying to get answers for when you wrote this.
Well, I think I've memorized my opening ranges fairly well, but those GTO charts are basically based on when everybody folds to you.
Yes.
Or maybe when there's one limper. And I understand the concept of if you've got a limper in front of you, you would change your open raise. Most people add 1x for the limper. But I play in games where there are more unstudied people and I'm getting lots of limps. Either I'm in late position and 4 people will have limped in front of me, or even if I'm in third position, I get 2 limps in front of me, I make a raise, and then I get 4 callers all around the table. And generally, I'm going to get outflopped unless I have raised a premium hand. And the GTO ranges are designed to be a little bit wider than a premium hand.
Definitely.
So I'm going into these and I just get myself into these circumstances where I end up having to fold a lot after having open raised. And it just seems that I'm bleeding away chips on these open raises. And I just haven't been able to find the right equation to know how to get rid of so many of these limpers.
Mm.
And my real question was, should I be changing my range? Should I be tightening it up? Should I be changing my bet size? Should I be playing more suited connectors and less low Broadway cards, et cetera, et cetera? I'm just sort of looking for a formula that helps me refine my opening ranges.
Yeah, I mean, we all like having rules to follow, right? Like that helps when it comes to this kind of stuff, just general rules of thumb. And so I think we'll talk a bit about the cash games that you're playing in at first. I know Chris Jones wants to talk also about sort of some of the tournament ramifications as well, because we talk a lot about tournaments here at Rec Poker, but it is a similar game, but a slightly different game as well. Your incentives are different, and your action should be different. So first of all, John, you are not alone, my friend. I think a lot of people struggle with this as well. They're playing in games with less experienced players who are limping a lot. You're getting to, it's hard to get heads up. You know, you're playing a lot of pots multi-way, and anytime you're playing a lot of pots multi-way, the strength of your hand really matters a lot more than heads up. You just don't get a chance to take the pot away nearly as often facing 3 or 4 opponents as you do facing one opponent. One opponent is going to miss the flop a lot. If you've got 3 or 4 other people in the hand, one of them is going to interact with that board hard enough that you're not going to be able to bluff them off as easily. So you end up going to showdown more, and that does have some ramifications for what we should be doing pre-flop in that spot. So I'll just say the general rules that I generally think about. I mean, it kind of depends on who are the limpers. Are these people who limp and fold? Are they players who limp and call? Are they players who limp and re-raise? And if so, is it in a balanced fashion? You might change the range of hands that you choose to raise over limpers, depending on what kind of player they are. But let's talk mostly about players that limp and call. Players that, and this is most limpers. Most players that limp are wide passive players. They're playing wide, weak ranges, playing them passively. And just because they've limped, they've already kind of told you, hey, I want to see a flop, and I'm not the raising kind. So a lot of limpers are people that limp and then call raises. So when that's the case, as we said at the top, you're going to end up going multi-way a lot. So when it comes to the range of hands that you might choose to raise over limpers, I think it does make sense to tighten that up a bit to eliminate some of the worst hands that you would have in your opening raise and just fold those instead, to call with some of the other ones, and then to raise over limpers with a stronger range than you would open raise from that position. And then it just comes down to sizing. We've talked about this before. Some players, the general rule that we talk about in tournaments is, 4 big blinds plus 1 for every limper is a way to kind of have a general rule for it. But I think in cash games, and particularly in live cash games, that sizing isn't going to do it. You're going to have to size it right up and maybe even get into some uncomfortable sizes. And that might also affect the range of hands that you choose to make that play with. So I guess that's kind of my general thinking. I do raise over limpers with a slightly tighter range to a larger sizing, and then you just have to play poker post flop. But the key is to find the pain point for that table, to find the threshold where the number of big blinds where you don't get 4 or 5 callers after you raise, and that really changes from table to table. Some tables, let's just say you're playing 1-3, so someone limps for $3. If you make it 15, maybe you'll get a couple folds and you'll end up heads up or with one other player. Some other tables, it's going to have to be 20 or 25. I mean, I've been on some tables where you can basically, they want to see a flop. They came here to see flops. And once you're raising that big, you really, if you're not going to get folds, you really do have to have a pretty strong hand, because now you're playing an inflated pot. Hopefully you're in position. but I mean, you definitely have range advantage. You can outplay them on a lot of boards if you do get heads up. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. Chris, you had some really good responses right off the top of this one. Why don't you sort of take us through what are you considering when you're facing multiple limpers? And is what is your goal? Is your goal to get it heads up, or is your goal to get multi-way with a big pot, or what are you trying to do when you see people limping in front of you?
I think we want to, so like the way I start thinking about this is the first thing I like to, and I think you kind of explored this, but really get at the limping mindset, or what is the limping incentive, and the limping player just wants to see a flop, and they want to see it as cheap as they possibly can. I mean, that's what they want, right? And I think then our approach is really about looking at our entire range and diverging it into sort of 3 categories of hands. Like if it just folded to us, we'd have, okay, we know our ranges, right? Now we're going to take that range and we're going to divide our range up into 3 categories. The kind that I'm just going to fold because that I would otherwise open, because with limpers in front of me, I'm just going to get into trouble with this and it's not worth it. Then there's the kind where we can overlimp, right? Where we've got these, and I think these are the ones that we tend to think of as sort of the speculative type hands that play really well multi-way. So your 5-6 of hearts, your pocket 3s, your these hands where we're going to get post flop and we know what's happening. And these are the ones that we can just say, okay, we're going to go 5-way with this. And if I don't flop a 3, if I don't get a set of 3s on this, I'm out, I'm done. So those are pretty easy to play post flop, and we're not going to lose a lot with them that way. And then the other ones I think we are going to want to, as you kind of described, is just, and in a cash game, I will go very big with my strong sort of linear holdings until I can get to a point. I am not trying to get everybody to fold, but if I keep getting, like, if I raise it in your example, right? If I raise it to it's a 1-3 game, I raise it to 15 and I get 5 callers. Okay, the next time I'm going to 25. And if I still get 5 callers, now I'm narrowing the range, the value range with which I'm doing this. I'm not going to do it. I need to have really strong holdings, but now I'm going to big until I can see the point at which I can get heads up, or everybody folds, and that's fine. Okay. So, and I did it with a really strong holding that stinks, but like we can only play effectively. It's really hard to play multi-way. And we want to find the point where these players are going to have that's kind of too rich for my blood, and kind of try to find that pain point. So those are the kind of the place I'd start with. I'd be curious to hear what others think too.
I have a totally different way of looking at it, to tell you the truth, Chris. So let's talk about how I might do it. First of all, you talked about changing your range and having 3 different parts of your range. I think really the only thing I would do differently is I don't actually remove any cards from my range. I may limp some hands, like you mentioned, some small suited connectors, small pairs, that sort of thing, just to over limp. But my range is probably going to stay pretty much the same as it would if it had folded to me. And if I'm going to raise, then I'm just going to raise my normal raise size plus 1 big blind for every limper. And if I get 5 callers, so be it. I'm going to go to a flop, and I think I'm going to feel a little bit more confident about my ability to play post flop than they are. Understanding the kinds of ranges that they have, and understanding that most players that limp are looking to hit a flop. And if they hit a flop, they're going to get aggressive. That's when you're going to hear from them. If they don't hit a flop hard, they're not going to be very aggressive. And then if you happen to get one of those hands, like an overpair, a top pair, top kicker type hand, you can probably get some value from those hands. And again, unless you hear something from them, chances are you're going to be ahead of them. But at the same time, when you got multiple limpers, you definitely have to be careful post flop. And that's just the way I play it. I don't try to get, I'm not trying to bet big enough to get a whole bunch of people to fold. I just don't, there's a lot of hands you can do that with, but I just don't feel very comfortable doing that. I would rather just play my regular game and just try to understand where those people are coming from. Now, I've played with people that they'll limp ace king, because ace king is a drawing hand. It's not a limping hand. It's just it's not a made hand. They're going to limp ace king, and you get to the river, you go, oh my God, they had ace king. I was sitting here with ace queen thinking I'm golden. That happens. But for the most part, you're going to find those middling type cards. And if you get one of those middling type flops, you got to be very careful.
And Chris is talking about sort of stymieing our opponents. They want to see a flop for cheap, and so our job is to kind of stop them from doing that, and then changing the dynamic of the table so that they're going to be playing our kind of poker. And Rob, I think, is coming at it from more sort of like adapting himself to that dynamic at the table, and instead of trying to force more heads up pots with the initiative, he's really and correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, but you're talking more about sort of just putting yourself in a position to outplay those players. Even though you're going to be playing more multi-way hands, you're not going to have the initiative. You're just going to kind of play good solid poker, and that's the choice that you've made. Is that fair?
Yeah, and at the same time, you're practicing pot control, right? Because you're not trying to put so much money in there to get people to fold. You're just putting the normal amount that you would put in there anyway, and then just playing post flop.
That is the way that I've been approaching it and the way I've been playing it. But I've been finding that, again, with 5 people in the hand, I'm getting out flopped 4 out of 5 times. And you're exactly right, Rob. I do hear from them and I know to fold. But I just feel like I'm bleeding off these open raises so much that my stack's going down more quickly than, and of course, you just get on a roll where you don't hit a flop for an hour and a half. And of course that happens to all of us, or I could hit 3 flops in a row. But I just find it, the example that I put in there is I opened with ace jack and I got, I don't know, 5 callers. And it's clear to me, I think, that I didn't open big enough. But then I put in a pretty good, and there's a jack on the flop. I put in a pretty good size raise and I got called.
You raise or you just c bet?
I see bet. You're right.
Okay.
I see bet and I got called. And the flop came off a rag and suddenly this woman led into me for $35. So it's exactly what you say. I know I'm going to hear from them, but I fold my cards and she turns over 2-6 offsuit and she had 2 pair. She had hit a 6 on the flop and the 2 on the turn. And so at that point, I had put in $35 or something to get to that point. And I don't know, maybe that is the way to play it. And I just got unlucky on that one hand because most of the time she's not going to hit a 2. But then she's not going to call my $25 bet and I'll have made, $8 on the hand because well, no, that's not true. I'll have made $40 or $50 because so many people call my open raise. So it just gets frustrating to see people turning over these cards.
I think there's a few things. So I agree with both Rob and Chris, who look at it completely differently. First thing to remember is limpers beget limpers and callers beget callers. So once you start that chain, it's easy to keep on going because everyone's like, well, I'm priced in. So I definitely agree with Chris's point on dividing your range and taking the portion of your range that plays well against in a multi-way pot and playing that portion as a limp and play it multi-way. The thing to be careful of is if you're playing your 5-6 suited and the flop comes, Jack 6 deuce, that's not a good flop for you. You've got to be able to get rid of those one pair hands. You're really looking to make a big hand in a multi-way pot. You have to have a stronger hand to go. The other thing to remember is, why are you raising? Okay, so if you're raising because you have a better hand, one way to look at it is that you're increasing the pot and you are going to win that portion of the pot more often than others. However, you're also decreasing your pot to stack ratio, and you are decreasing the edge that you have, the amount of cash that you can utilize for your edge, the amount of multiplier your edge has for the remainder of the hand. So you really do want to limit the field. So if you are raising and you're never getting any folds, then only raise if you really want to play a big pot, because you're not getting any other value from that raise. You're not thinning the field. So you need to raise bigger in the cases where you're going to raise. And this is where I disagree a little bit with Rob, in that there are portions of my range that I will end up dropping out, because there might be things like ace 9 that is a very difficult hand to play multi-way and know that you've got, because your ace may not be good and your ace may cost you a lot of money with the second best hand. So
But
I
ace
might
9
be
is only in my button range.
okay. I guess it's not in my button range. I mean, it's way earlier than my button range. So I will tighten my range with what I am. I won't limp everything that I would have raised with, or definitely won't raise everything I would have raised with. I tend to look at it, if it's just a single limper in front of me, I ignore the limp. I mean, I increase the size that I'm going to bet, but I don't let the limp does not influence the strength of my hand. Once you get 2 hands in there, 2 to 3 limpers, then it's more, I do start to tighten it. And once you get like 4 or 5, I almost treat it, instead of opening, I'm making a 3-bet, and I use my 3-betting range. So I think there are things you can do. The thing is, if you are playing with bigger pots, your variance is going to be higher.
Mhm.
So it could be that you are making all of the right moves and you just happen to be hitting the bad side of variance. And it takes a long time for variance to even out. But I still, with the premium hands like an ace king, you really want to play that against 1, maybe 2 other players. You don't want to go 5 ways with that.
Yeah, and so I really love what you just said there, John, because I think that is, for me, part of what we are increasing our variance. There's no doubt, right? Like, if we're going to have a player who, if we make a big bet and we only do it with a really extreme good part of our range, right? Like, we're doing maybe jacks plus an ace king or something like that, but we're making it really big now because we have all these players who won't fold. We are increasing our variance. If they're going to call us with deuce 6 suited, and we have queens, and they're going to hit deuce 6 on that, we are going to lose probably our stack. I mean, let's just get, I mean, that, at this point we've put so much in, we're probably losing our stack here. But if they're going to call us with deuce 6 suited, and I can have that premium of a holding, I don't mind the SPR getting lower. I don't mind, in fact, like that post flop edge that I might have, I'm fine at already being on the table, because I'm already expressing that against a player who is making a gigantic mistake by calling me. And sometimes they're going to outflop me and they're going to win. But what I really truly want to avoid is having queens and having 5 players come along with me, because now I'm just, I mean, there's a, Like, where do I go? Like, I'm just in hang on mode, no matter what the flop is. If it's an overpair, do people, there's no flop except maybe like a queen that I feel good about when I'm going 5 ways. And even a queen could be dicey depending what's on the board.
And part of the problem is we haven't forced our opponents to define their range at all. If we limp along, then all we're doing is we're playing against several players, and the only action they've taken so far is to limp or to overlimp. So their range is extremely wide, and that makes it harder for us to exclude hands from their range as we continue through the hand. So it makes it hard. It makes it harder for us to know, oh, well, do they have that sneaky 2 pair there? Because our brains aren't used to parsing ranges that have every single combo in it. And so we're going to be wrong more post flop. And that's a problem. Yeah, Chris.
One last thing I'll say about this too is I think limpers tend to price in the raise that is conventional wisdom. Like, they expect, I mean, they're happy to go to a flop with 1 big blind in the middle, but they very much expect to just limp and call with their entire range. And they think they're getting a cheaper, like, so that, well, nobody's really going to raise me. I can still see a flop for like 4 or 5 big blinds. That's what I want with this hand, with my 10-9 of diamonds or whatever. So the only thing that's going to sort of like shake that up is changing our sizing. So that's why I advocate it.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. And some of this is really also very stack dependent, because obviously the deeper the stacks are, the larger you need to make your isolation raise in order to bring that fold equity, to bring that pain to them so that they're reaching that threshold where they can release the hand. John, did you have something there as well?
I just really like the point Chris made there about how hard it is to range all of these limpers. And again, in this example hand, I just had to make the assumption that this woman had come along with a pair of 2s or a pair of 6s and hit a set, because I couldn't for the life of me imagine. And for the record, it was 2-6 off, not 2-6.
Right.
I just couldn't
Yeah.
imagine that she had that. But I knew by her bet that she had something more than a pair of jacks. So to Rob's point, yes, those people will let you know that they have something. And unfortunately, you have to drop even, I mean, I had top pair with an ace kicker, but I knew I had to drop the hand. But it's that much harder to range them. And that's also part of what my frustration is. Yes.
And I think there's kind of 2 points on that. The first is that these players that limp and call raises a lot, they're typically going to be less experienced players. So they're not playing necessarily the same kind of range you might put a more experienced player on anyway. And then the other thing is, when you do get post flop, and this is what Rob was saying earlier, it's harder to range opponents, but it's almost easier to read their action because they're less experienced players. And so you can make assumptions about how they're unbalanced, and you can let that guide you. Just in the example that you're talking about there, John, when they come out with that big lead on the turn, it would be hard to literally go through and range them for all the hands they could have limped with, and then just called the C bet on the flop and then done this with. But your red alarm is going off in the back of your head already, and you're thinking they're only ever doing this with a very strong hand. And what we have to do is kind of listen to that a lot more, I think, in these spots, and probably fold more than we would otherwise, because I guess it really depends on the spot. I guess what I'm trying to say is you have to listen to the action very carefully, and if there is something going off in the back of your head when you're playing against an inexperienced player, you should usually be listening to that little thing going off in the back of your head, because you're reading the flow of the game better than they are. Chris or John?
One other thing I'll say about limpers too is what I like about this is that lead on that turn is very different. And so limpers, what we also want to remember about them is we do not have to read as much into their passive calling actions as we do their aggressive actions. So like sometimes when a player, like if I make a C bet and a player calls me, or I make a double barrel and a player has called me, I will give them a lot of credit for, like, oh man, they have something here, like it could be pretty strong, but they're not just doing this with nothing. And I don't think that is always true of limpers. They'll have something, but their something will be a lot weaker when they're just calling you down than you're used to. So if you like make that second bet, and we should be betting a lot against these type of players because they will call wider. Because again, it's the mindset of, I want to see, I want to get there, I want to hit. Oh, I've got hope. And so they will call that, like on a this deuce 6 offsuit kind of hand. If there was like a king 5-4 board, I think they would call down at least a double barrel. Most limpers would, because like, what if I hit that 3? What if I hit that 3? And we can take a lot of advantage of that. It's only when they wake up and start taking aggressive actions where they check raise us or they lead out, that's when we have to be like, oh God.
Yeah, and sort of like Chris was saying just before there, limpers, they like to call. They are passive players. And so even though we can't range them effectively, when they make aggressive actions, that should kind of indicate to us something, because their natural play is to be passive. So aggression should read as strength. John? Or
Yeah.
Rob, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well,
Go ahead,
I
John.
was just going to mention that in general, as there are more people in the pot, people tend to be more honest. So you can take what they are doing for face value, particularly if they are making an aggressive action. That means they have something. Now you still need to evaluate the caliber of their play, because some people think third pair is the nuts. But also, along with what Chris was saying earlier, a call is also a face up saying, but it might just mean they want to see another card. It doesn't necessarily denote strength.
Yeah, I was going to add to that I've seen people will call all the way down to the river, hoping that they hit. And I end up checking the river and we see the cards and it's absolutely nothing. And you go, what were they calling with all the way to the river? Well, they were calling with what Chris said, hope that they were going to hit one of their cards, and like John just said, a lot of times people will hit a pair and think they're golden, regardless of whether it's third pair or even fourth pair. They don't, it's just, they think it's golden because they have caught some part of the board. So they overvalue what their hands are. So now, if they're betting out into you, that they got two pair or better.
And some players, they'll just decide that you're bluffing. And I've been in this position. I've been in this position where I raise over a limper, they call, I go bet on every street. And on the river, they're facing the bet. And this guy said to me, like, I know you don't have it. I call. But he called with 7 high. Like he was right that I didn't have it, but I was bluffing with a better hand than he was. And it was like, we don't necessarily know the kind of mistakes some of these players might make, or like what their actual reasons are for some of it. There's people that are just like, oh, you don't have it, so I'm not going to let you win this pot. Those are good people to be playing against. A lot of the people that we're describing are good people to be playing against. So we're doing something right there already, John. If you're playing in games where lots of players are calling huge raises pre-flop with garbage hands, that will pay off in the long run, I promise.
two of the things is, one, I have learned not to do much bluffing against some of these people, simply because literally that they will call you down with a three. They have a three in their hand, there's a three on the board, and they've got a pair and it's the nuts, and they're just going to keep calling you. Doesn't matter, how much you bet. But the other thing is when an ace hits on the flop, nobody in these games is capable of folding an ace pre-flop. An ace deuce, ace three, ace, it doesn't matter. If there's an ace on the board and I don't have one, chances are very high that they do. It's not automatic, I understand that, but I really have to get my radar up and be very aware. And it doesn't mean they're going to bet it either.
Right.
They're just going to go along with the flow of the game. Somebody mentioned earlier, I think John said something about if I open and get 3-bet, never happens, or it will not happen with less than queens.
Right.
Absolutely. It will not happen with less than queens.
Hey, John, where are you playing these days? I'd like to come down and hang out. I'd like to come play in this game.
Well,
Yeah.
you're welcome.
Yeah. John Somsky, did you have something there?
I did, but what John Crowell said was so illuminating that it just totally went away from my brain.
Chris?
I'll just say, like, if I'm in a game with a bunch of limpers and I know that I cannot be raised, I am in the right game.
Yeah. But you do have to buckle up, right, Chris? Like,
yes,
that's part of
to
it.
Buckle up. You're gonna be in these swings of variance where you're gonna have the times where you had the queens against the deuce six and you're gonna lose it all. But that is, boy.
It's a good spot.
It's also the time that you walk away from the game with 4 or 5 buy-ins in your pocket.
Yeah.
Right. Yep. And it's hard to do, like, John, we've talked before about, you drive all the way out there, you got a couple buy-ins in your pocket, and you don't want to lose them in the first half hour just because you're taking a higher variance approach. But ultimately, in cash games in particular, you want to give yourself as big an edge as possible. And a great way to do that is by pre-flop having a much stronger hand than your opponent and playing a big pot. And it is going to burn you sometime. And I know you know this already, John, but for some of our listeners, they're less familiar with it. It is going to burn you on a few hands, but on many, many, many more hands, you're gonna pick those pots up and win bigger pots, and it's definitely going to be worth it in the long run. So I want everyone to think about, we've talked about this a lot. I know we usually like to keep these strategy forums editions a little shorter, but just think about a couple things and then we'll wrap it up here, gang. So I want you to think about the kinds of hands that you never isolate raise with, the kind of hands that you always isolate raise with, or the hands that you never fold, or the hands that you always fold, something like that. Always or never, the hands that you always call. I'll go first just to get us going. So when I'm facing multiple limpers, I'm pretty much always calling with my low pocket pairs. For instance, let's say like 2s through 6s. I like set mining. They're easy to play. You do kind of get set over set every once in a while, but not that frequently. And I'm almost always over limping with low pocket pairs. Suited aces, I'm just never folding. Sometimes I'm calling them and sometimes I'm ISO raising with them. They're nice to ISO raise with because they've got an ace blocker and they've got a lot of playability post flop, but they're also nice to play multi-way because you're going to be the one with the highest flush. And the deeper you are, the worse it is to get set over set or flush over flushed because you have a lot more chips in your stack that you're going to lose on those hands. So the deeper you are, having the nut flush becomes a lot more important. And that might even affect whether you raise over limpers or just over limp with some of the low suited connectors that we've been talking about as well. Because the deeper you go, the more multi-way you are. If you're saying I'm going to play a 6-handed pot, 300 big blinds deep, 5-6 of hearts is a good hand, but if the action's getting aggressive out there when you make your flush, you're probably got the second best flush out there. So I'll start raising with those suited connectors more to thin out the field, so there's just fewer competing flushes available, and calling more with some of the suited aces for the same reason. But what about you guys? Are there hands that you always do something or you never do something? Like I tend to just not play hands like ace six offsuit, or those hands that they can really just make one pair with no kicker, 10 jack off. Like I'm just gonna find other ways to play those. I don't know, maybe 10 jack off isn't the end of the world. But what about you, Rob?
I think one of the things that we have to really keep in mind is we don't have to be balanced in this game, because the people that we're playing against are not aware of what we're doing
Great point.
typically.
Yep.
So if you decide to raise really big only with your premiums, you can do that. And they're not gonna notice the difference. And if you raise just slightly with your medium pairs and your medium suited connectors, they're not gonna realize that that's different than the raise you had when you had aces or kings. So I think we don't have to worry about being balanced, so we can really take a more exploitative viewpoint of how we're going to play these hands pre-flop.
Great point. John Somsky?
I was gonna say, I tend to play trouble hands a little less. So the rag aces, the aces that can't make a straight, or are non-suited. Hands like a ragged king or queen, I tend to want to play more suited hands, less unsuited, and more connected. Maybe some suited gappers, but probably not as many two gappers or three gappers, because you really want to have a more powerful hand in the end.
And like we were saying earlier, it does kind of depend what kind of opponents you're playing against. Not many players, like Chris was saying, are going to limp and then re-raise you with a balanced range. Some will, but you just make a note on those players and then just, work around them. But I think this is a great point from Rob as well about just not having to worry about being balanced. And if these players were very, very thoughtful players and very attentive players, they wouldn't be limping as much as they are. So that tells you a lot. That tells you a lot right there.
I like what John said, but I think I already do that no matter what with my range.
Oh yeah. Old man coffee down there in the the
pretty
end of the
much.
table?
Yeah, pretty much.
I know that's not true.
But that all gets right to the very heart of my question. The original question, the example was in my GTO range.
Yeah.
From the button, I'm opening ace five off. But my original question was, do I need to start dropping ace five, ace six, ace seven off in these, and just a few pips off of my opening range? And I think clearly the answer to that is yes, in these particular cases. Yep.
Yeah, I think so. And for our folks listening at home, just for terminology, we talk about open raising usually as everyone folds to us and we get to open the pot with a raise. In this case, when people have limped in front of us, we're not technically opening the pot anymore, but we're raising over limpers or over limping, or we're ISO raising to isolate the limper or some of the limpers. But it's basically it's the same situation where you're the first one making a raise and not just calling the big blind and limping along there. What other thoughts should we have here, gentlemen, before we cruise on out of this episode? I thought I had something I wanted to say too, John Somsky. You're not the only one who's letting a few good ideas leak out the ear as we go. Well, this probably won't be the last time we talk about facing limpers. This is something that happens quite a lot. So maybe we'll just save it for the next time we get to have a conversation similar to this. All right. Well, then, of course, my great thanks to John Crowell, Chris Jones, John Somsky, and Rob Washam. Of course, Mark Vershawn at Website Amp, and the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino, but mostly you, the listeners.